Welcome back. NBC News has obtained a copy of this new tell-all book from the president's niece, a book the Trump family attempted to stop in court. The book by Mary Trump, called Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man, paints a scathing picture of the president and is full of unflattering anecdotes, as the title might indicate. Mary Trump, who is a PhD clinical psychologist, calls her uncle a narcissist for starters, adding, quote, "The fact is, Donald's pathologies are so complex and his behavior so often inexplicable that coming up with an accurate and comprehensive diagnosis would require a full battery of psychological and neuropsychological tests that he'll never sit for." The president's niece also describes him as a liar who cheated to get ahead, starting with her explosive allegation that the White House denies that Trump paid someone to take his SATs after he had set his sights on the University of Pennsylvania. Quote, "To hedge his bets, he enlisted Joe Shapiro, a smart kid with a reputation for being a good test taker, to take the SATs for him. That was much easier to pull off in the days before photo IDs and computerized records. Donald, who never lacked for funds, paid his buddy well." Again, the White House has said this book is full of falsehoods, called the allegation that Trump paid someone to take his SATs absurd and completely false. With us to talk about all of this, Emily Jane Fox, national correspondent for Vanity Fair, who also happens to be the author of Born Trump: Inside America's First Family, which we figured would give her some good vision on this subject. So, Emily, many books have been written by people formerly close to this family, not anymore, former members of the inner circle, journalists with a lot of access. How is this different, and how will the impact potentially be different?
The difference between this book and the many other books that we've seen come out of the White House and around other reporting about the Trump family and about President Trump himself is that this is written by a member of that family. I think the prospect of anybody in your family writing a tell-all book about you, particularly one that clinically diagnoses you, is a very scary proposition. But this really hits at the specific fleshy part of Trump, the part that is very concerned with the branding of the Trump family and the myth making surrounding them, someone who hates leakers and people who are disloyal to him, and someone who is very concerned about people who make a buck off of his name. I think individually, each of those things really irks this president. Combining the two of them feels potentially explosive to him as he heads into an election year. And I always think about this, and I've thought about this as I reported my book and as I've reported on the Trump family since then. Fred Trump, President Trump's father, really wanted to be rich. Donald Trump was born rich, and so he really wanted to be famous. And then the next generation of Trumps were born rich and famous, and they want to be powerful. And I think with this book, it's very clear that the next generation of the Trumps have a lot of power.
And what about the crumbling of the early mythology, the early part of Donald Trump's life, do you think will be potentially the most hurtful that's buried in between these pages?
I think all of the exploration of who his father was and what kind of a father he was to his children, and particularly to Donald Trump, really is wounding to him. This is someone whose only photo on his desk is of his father. That relationship was something that he prizes. And I don't think that there's a great deal of introspection that happens in that Oval Office or in the residence of the East Wing about his relationships with people. I think he has built up this ideal of this relationship that now his niece is saying is not true. And I think maybe he doesn't feel like this is an accurate portrait, but someone else in his family does feel this way. And I think that could be really, really wounding to him.
There is a phrase from the world of analysis, and it goes like this: damaged people damage people. Donald Trump, apparently not one for much self-reflection or analysis, may really resent the basis of the book, the author's PhD in the subject, any kind of attempt at a psychological deconstruction, especially one that goes after the father.
Sure. I think that this is of all of the books, and we have seen many, this is the one that he has dreaded facing. This is the one that he cannot dismiss as someone who is a coffee boy, a low-level employee, someone who was just disloyal and out there to get access to him and then later write a book. This is a member of his own family who has known him for decades and decades and decades, and until this very moment has stayed quiet about this. This is not a John Bolton coming out with a tell-all to then go on to the next chapter of his life. This is someone who has sat with these experiences, these memories, and these judgments of her uncle, and then decided it was so important that she needed to tell that, and against the will of the rest of her family. That's a very, very powerful thing, and one I think that Donald Trump is going to have a hard time squaring.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.